There is a kind of pain that does not feel ordinary when it happens. It feels larger than the relationship itself. Larger than betrayal. Larger than disappointment. It feels like you were pulled into someone else's darkness, not just to be hurt by it, but to witness what they had become. And if you have ever loved a narcissistic person, you may know exactly what I mean, because at some point the relationship stops feeling like a misunderstanding and starts feeling like a confrontation between two realities. The one they are performing, and the one you can feel underneath it. That is why these relationships leave such a deep mark. It is not only that they lied, manipulated, projected, withheld, or rewrote what happened. It is that somewhere in the middle of all of it, you began to understand something terrifying. Your presence itself was becoming a problem for them. Not because you were abusive. Not because you were impossible to love. But because you kept bringing something into the room they did not know how to live beside. Truth. Realness. Emotional accuracy. The kind of presence that notices what is said, what is avoided, what does not add up, what feels off long before the evidence becomes undeniable. People often blame themselves for this stage. They think maybe they were too sensitive, too perceptive, too intense, too questioning. Maybe if they had been easier, quieter, less boundaried, less aware, the relationship would have stayed intact. But that is not what was happening. What was happening is that the narcissistic person was meeting a kind of human presence they could not easily absorb into the fantasy. Someone who could feel the split between their image and their inner life. Someone who could sense that the charm did not match the character, that the words did not match the behavior, that the tenderness often arrived with hooks in it. And for someone built on performance, that is deeply destabilizing. Because narcissistic people do not fear conflict the way most people imagine. Conflict they can manage. They can deny, deflect, escalate, seduce, intimidate, reverse the roles, and keep the whole exchange spinning until you forget how it started. What they fear much more is sustained contact with a person who remains real. A person who does not fully disappear into the distortion. A person whose empathy does not make them blind, but accurate. That is what made you difficult for them in the deepest sense. You may have entered with love, with patience, with the benefit of the doubt. You may have stayed longer than you should have because you could see the wound underneath the behavior, because you believed that if someone was truly seen, truly loved, truly met with honesty, something in them might soften. And maybe that was the tragedy of it. Not that you were naive, but that you brought sincerity into a place that had learned to use sincerity as leverage. Still, what you brought mattered. Because a narcissistic person can survive around indifference. They can survive around superficial people, distracted people, enabling people, frightened people, people who want the image more than the truth. But someone who keeps bringing emotional reality back into the room creates pressure. Not always with speeches. Not always with confrontation. Sometimes just with presence. With questions. With the way you remember what was said last week and notice that today's version does not match. With the way your body registers the lie before your mind catches up. With the way your care came with conscience, not blind obedience. That kind of presence becomes a mirror. And people love mirrors only when the reflection flatters them. This is where the relationship often starts turning darker. Because once they sense that you are not going to be a passive witness to the fantasy, they begin trying to reposition you inside it. Your empathy becomes too much. Your memory becomes the problem. Your boundaries become selfish. Your hurt becomes instability. Your questions become attacks. Suddenly the person who kept bringing warmth, patience, and benefit of the doubt is recast as the threat. And if you have lived through this, you know how disorienting it is. You start out trying to understand them, and end up defending your right to perceive what is right in front of you. That reversal is not accidental. It is the cost of becoming the mirror, because the boundary is the moment you stop offering your life as a testing ground for someone else's avoidance. It is the moment you say, sometimes quietly and sometimes through full absence, that your compassion is no longer available for exploitation. It is the moment love stops meaning endurance at any cost and starts meaning alignment with what is real. That is why narcissistic people react so violently to boundaries. The boundary does not just limit access. It announces that the distortion no longer has full permission to live inside your life. A real boundary changes the whole atmosphere. It says, I see what this is. It says, I am not staying inside the version of the story that requires my confusion. It says, I will disappoint your false self before I betray my real one. That is why boundaries are often followed by backlash. Smear campaigns. Sudden coldness. Mockery. Silent treatment. A flurry of attempts to provoke guilt, doubt, panic, or regret. The backlash is not proof that your boundary was wrong. It is often proof that it touched the structure that was feeding on you. And then comes the part no one prepares you for. The grief after clarity. Because once you understand that their rejection was not a verdict on your worth but a confession of their unwillingness, you still have to grieve. You still have to grieve the fantasy that honesty might have saved it. The fantasy that love offered cleanly would have been enough. The fantasy that if you just stayed accurate, steady, and open-hearted long enough, they would choose to rise. Some people do not rise. Some people protect the wound instead. Some people would rather exile the mirror than face the reflection. And that truth is brutal, but it is also freeing. Because the moment you stop taking their rejection as evidence against your value, your energy begins coming back to you. The moment you stop asking why truth was not enough for them, and start asking why you kept trying to earn safety inside a structure built on distortion, something deeper begins to heal. You stop studying them as if they hold the missing answer. You begin studying your own thresholds, your own wounds, your own old conditioning around love, hope, rescue, and endurance. You begin seeing how much of your suffering came not from loving deeply, but from staying too long in a place where your depth was being turned against you. That is where pain begins becoming wisdom. Not instantly. Not beautifully. But honestly. You learn what your nervous system knew before your mind was ready to admit it. You learn what inconsistency does to the soul. You learn what it costs to keep overriding your own perception for the sake of preserving connection. You learn that being accurate is not the same thing as being cruel, and that someone calling you too much may simply mean you were too real for the lie to survive around. And most importantly, you learn responsibility in its cleanest form. Not responsibility for their choices. Not responsibility for fixing what they refuse to face. Responsibility for your own soul now. For your own peace. For your own standards. For the future self that should never again have to beg reality to stay reality inside a relationship. That is the peace worth keeping. Because if the relationship was a confrontation, then your healing becomes an answer. Not to them. To life. To yourself. To the part of you that almost disappeared trying to make meaning out of someone else's refusal. Your healing says the truth did not die just because they rejected it. Your healing says your tenderness was never the problem. Your accuracy was never the problem. Your limits were never the problem. The problem was that you offered something real to someone who needed unreality to survive. And now you know. You were not broken because they turned on you. You were dangerous to the structure because you stayed real too long. And once you understand that, the story changes. You stop seeing yourself as the person they discarded. You start seeing yourself as the person who finally understood what their rejection was really saying. Not you were unlovable. Not you were too much. Not you failed. It was saying something far darker and far simpler than that. It was saying, I cannot keep being who I pretend to be in front of someone who sees me clearly. And that was never your shame to carry.